Jesus in the garden, newly risen from the dead, who stood by weeping Mary and who heard the words she said, as if you were the gardener, till at last your shepherd's voice called her Mary, and with one word gave her reason to rejoice. Jesus in the garden, ever new, but still the same, help me recognize you in the speaking of my name.
Jesus on the journey, fellow traveller on the road, who met two sad disciples, walking with them as you showed the meaning of the scriptures that predicted you would rise, but only when you blessed the meal could they believe their eyes. Jesus on the journey, meet me where my hopes have fled, help me recognize you in the breaking of the bread.
Jesus in the locked room, breaking through despair and doubt, who comforted your friends when they had shut the whole world out, who came again for Thomas and revealed your hands and side so that he could touch and know you as alive, though you had died. Jesus in the locked room, breaking through our self-built bars, help me recognize you in the touching of your scars.
So what is this locked room we're talking about? As you'll see in the wonderful background just behind me, Jesus has risen from the dead, but his disciples haven't yet come to terms with it. They don't believe the first message they hear from the women who visited the grave, and in particular Thomas, the disciple often known as Doubting Thomas, simply because of this encounter. He hasn't seen or believed, and he says, I won't see or believe until I touch Jesus, put my hand into his wounds, see the nail marks. And of course, famously, he then does, and falls at Jesus's feet and says, my Lord and my God. What does this tell us about the kind of God that we have? What does this tell us about the Easter message? I want to start off, just if you can see that, this is what we call in our family a magic sweetie. They've largely expired these days, so they don't work so well, but they were our cure-all for, you know, scraped knees and bruised shins and everything else that can go wrong with a child at a sort of minor injury level. Magic Sweetie would make it all better, and amazingly it did. And Magic Sweeties are fine for things which at the end of the day you can just get over. There's grown-up versions of Magic Sweeties, I think, for bad days at the office, for sleepless nights, for cooking disasters, whatever else it might be, embarrassing social gaffes perhaps. There are the equivalents of Magic Sweeties for adults too. But when it comes to real suffering, we don't want a Magic Sweetie or whatever the equivalent is. When it comes to real suffering, we want the company of somebody who knows our pain and who is with us and who loves us. Isaiah was a prophet who lived 800 years before Jesus, and he saw something, not the full picture, but something of God's plan of how Jesus was going to come. And he talked about Jesus as being despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain. If you have an older translation, acquainted with grief, you might recognize the turn of phrase. Jesus knew what it was to suffer with humanity. Jesus knew what it was to go through difficulty, and that is part of his glory. Part of the amazing story, part of the amazing nature of Jesus is that he suffered with us. In the book of Revelation, which gives us a picture of how this world wraps up and the next one comes into beginning, it says, we have this picture of the throne room of God, and John sees this epic scale picture of God's glory, and right at the center of it, standing at the very, very center, there's a huge throne, and on the throne there is a lamb looking like it's been slain. You might expect to see a king, all glorious with a crown and possibly glowing, but no, right at the center there's a lamb that looks as though it's been slain. And that's because Jesus's wounds continue into eternity, that they're not something that we can now forget about and push out the way. You know, oh, he went through that, but thank goodness, you know, we can forget about it now. No, that shows his love for us. They are marks of his love, and because they're marks of his love, they are glorious. I don't know if those of you who are women and have children, I don't know if maybe you might feel that way about the stretch marks or something like that. These are things that have been done to me for the love and the care of somebody else, but on an even more cosmic scale. There's a hymn that puts it this way: those wounds yet visible above, in beauty glorified. Jesus's pain and suffering that he went through is not somehow hushed away in glory. It's part of who he is. He is one who will love at all costs. He doesn't offer a magic sweetie to our suffering. He doesn't offer cheap distraction. He offers costly love. But he offers more than that. And I want to offer you a picture now. I want you to imagine, and it's obviously very topical at the moment, I want you to imagine two research doctors in their hospital, and around them are patients who are sick and dying, and many of their own staff who are sick and dying. And those two doctors have their arms around each other's shoulders, and they're with each other in that sorrow. Now that is a picture of compassion. That is a picture of suffering with. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Just hold that picture in your head. And now imagine that one of the doctors has themselves been sick with this disease, and from their own sickness have developed a cure. And they now have their arm around that other doctor, suffering with them, but also holding the cure in their hands. This is what Jesus does for us. He says, I'm with you in your suffering, but I also have a way through this. There is a hope that goes beyond this life. He has prepared a place for us, the other side of death, where there is no pain, no suffering, no hurt, no death. And we can be sure of it because Jesus has the scars on his body that show that he has died and come through death. It beggars belief, and we try to get our heads around it again and again, but ultimately every person that you can read about who's gone to try and investigate the resurrection of Christ, it seems to have come back writing a book about how they've been convinced by it. The fact is, Jesus raised from the dead, and from the other side of death, he says, I've prepared a place for you, and you can trust me because I've shown it by being raised from the dead. So this is the first part of our message. When you find yourself stressed or sad or in pain or anxious, there's a lot of anxiety around at the moment, depressed, bereaved, alone, remember Jesus, nail-scarred but also glorious, with you and pointing ahead to that speck on the horizon that is eternal life, the other side of death, saying, one day we'll be there.
Jesus on the shoreline, cooking breakfast for your friends, who offered guilty Peter one more chance to make amends, who filled a net with fish for him and helped him to recall the first catch that convinced him to respond to your first call. Jesus on the shoreline, know my best. Forgive my worst. Help me recognize you in the way I met you first.
Jesus on the shoreline. This is a different story that comes after Jesus was raised from the dead. This one primarily about Peter. Peter's back to fishing again. He's followed Jesus. First of all, he followed Jesus because he was a gifted teacher. And then he followed him because he came to realize that Jesus was the Messiah, and he swore unending loyalty to Jesus. And then he blew it. He denied Jesus, not just once in the heat of the moment, but 3 times spaced out over an evening because of the intense pressure he felt under and the worry that he had about what the implications would be of following Jesus. So what else is he good for now? He has to go back to what he knows, which is fishing. He's lost whatever hope he had for something better, and back he gets into his boat. And he spends all night fishing. And just to make things worse, he isn't even any good at that tonight. He doesn't catch any fish at all. So he's been up all night and it's been fruitless. What I want you to see is the beauty of how Jesus deals with him in this story, because it's indicative of how Jesus reacts to all of us, or not reacts even, how Jesus comes after all of us in a loving and gracious and kind way. Because this is what we read. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. And early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't realize that it was Jesus. And he called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. And then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It's the Lord," he wrapped the outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 meters. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals with some fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." And I'll pause the story there. Some things about how Jesus deals with Peter in this. First of all, Jesus goes to him. It would have been totally in Jesus's rights to say, "He knows where I am. I said where I'd be. He can come find me." But no, Jesus goes to him. And the first thing he says to him is not a word of rebuke. And Jesus had warned Peter that he was going to deny who Jesus was, deny Jesus and his association with Jesus. He'd warned him already. He said, "You're going to 3 times before the cock crows tomorrow." And Peter said, no, never, it's not going to happen. And Jesus says, no, you will. And he doesn't say, "I told you so," or anything like that. But instead, he reminds Peter of a first step of obedience that Peter took. He reminds him of a success, actually, that Peter had. You see, one of the first times that Jesus met Peter, he preached out of Peter's boat. And at the end of talking to the crowd, he said, "Push your boat out into deep water and let down your nets." And Peter said, "Jesus, I know you're a great teacher, but you're not a fisherman. We've been up all night. There's no fish." And Jesus said, "No, just do it." And they did. And immediately the nets were so full that they started to break. And Simon Peter falls at Jesus' feet and says, "Get away from me. I'm a sinful man." That first encounter, or not quite first, actually, it's an early encounter with Jesus, shaped Simon Peter's life and started off this journey of following Jesus. And Jesus reminds him of it now by doing almost the same thing again. He calls Peter and says, "Let's have another try. Come on, you did this well." The next thing is that Jesus provides, because they get to the shore and Jesus has already actually prepared breakfast. He's got fish and bread waiting there. He doesn't need them to have fished because he's already prepared food for them. But he still gives Peter the dignity of contributing. So he says, "Bring some of your catch, even though I've already got fish and bread here. We'll have a beach barbecue," and he eats with them. Jesus's gentleness, his desire to call Peter back, his desire to give him dignity, to remind him of success. These are all wonderful things about the nature of Jesus that it's really good for us to remember. Jesus is the glorious King. He's been beaten and crucified. He's come back from the other side of death. And instead of standing up there and saying, "Here I am, everybody, you can come to me if you want to," he goes gently after those who have fallen away. The next thing, going past where we read to, is that Jesus goes for a walk with Simon Peter. And as they're walking, Jesus asks him 3 times, "Simon Peter, do you love me?" And each time Simon Peter says, yes, I do. You know that I love you." And Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." Now, it seems a bit odd at first, and in fact, the third time, Simon Peter's, it says he's offended. He's hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? And then it sinks into him. He denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus is giving him 3 chances just to put that behind him and reaffirm his love for Christ. And then Jesus gives him a calling and a purpose. He doesn't just say, fine, you're back on the bench again. You're in the team, but I'll call on you if I need you. He immediately speaks to him and says, you've got a purpose in life. He says, feed my sheep. I've got a job for you. There's dignity and purpose in my calling for you. And I'm going to take another chance on you, even though you blew it last time. And in fact, actually, he looks ahead to Peter's death and he says, there's going to be a time when you will have the opportunity again to lay down your life for me, and this time you'll take it. And from what we read, Peter did. You see, all of this points to a really fundamental truth about Jesus. Jesus is not looking for technicalities on which to exclude people. He is going after people with a view to include them if they will be willing. In fact, Jesus did this a lot. He went to all kinds of people. He went to those who lived sinful lives. Those who were more obviously sinful is probably a better way to put it. We read about him working with tax collectors who were pretty unsavory characters in those days. We read about him spending time with women who may well have been engaged in prostitution. And he sought them out and he ate with them. And he showed them love before they changed. And then some of them changed and followed him. He taught and he warned the Pharisees and the other religious teachers who made themselves his enemies. And some of those that he taught and warned listened to him and followed him. He sought out people who the society of that time held in lower esteem, in particular women and foreigners and children, all people who in that society had a lower status, and he gave them dignity. He spent time with them, also those who were ill, and some of them followed him. Peter's past failings might have stood against him, but they weren't greater than Jesus's forgiveness. His intent wasn't to condemn Peter, but to re-include him. So there's a message for you today. If you're not a wholehearted follower of Christ this morning, God is not looking for a reason to exclude you, but to include you if you're willing. The glorious, nail-scarred, victorious Jesus that we've talked about is standing at the door to his kingdom, holding it wide open and saying, come in while the door's still open. Come on in, take the offer. He won't hold your past against you, but will offer forgiveness if we admit our faults and ask for it. He doesn't say that he'll protect us from all pain in this life. He never makes that promise. In fact, he warns us that there will be pain in this life, but he does promise an eternity free of it. It says again in the book of Revelation, this vision of the future, that God will be with his people and will wipe away every tear from their eyes. What he asks of us is that we believe in his resurrection, that we ask forgiveness for having lived our own way instead of his, and we agree to treat him as our highest authority from this day on. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't taken that offer, to take that offer and to ask him for it today. Asking God, we just call praying. That's all it is. It's nothing more special or any less special really than that. Talking to God in our own language. And so I want to lead us in praying now. And this is a prayer that's as valid whether you are already a follower of Christ or whether you've never followed Christ before, but you think, actually, this is what I need. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you that when you declared your mission, right back at the very beginning of your time ministering as an adult, you said, I'm here to bring the good news to the poor. You said, I'm here to bind up the brokenhearted, to set free captives, to bring freedom, to bring healing. and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. And Jesus, I thank you that that is seen in this Easter message. I thank you that it's seen in how you dealt with Peter, that you hold the door open and you say, if you will come in, the door is open. And Jesus, you don't ask very much of us. You ask for our love and our obedience. So Jesus, we want to say we are sorry that we have tried to live our own way. Sorry that we've made up our own versions of right and wrong and not even managed to stick to them. God, we accept that you get to make the rules, that you're Lord, and we accept that we need your help, that you're our rescuer. And we ask you to forgive us and to welcome us into your kingdom. Thank you that this prayer is not hopefully offered up with no real understanding of whether it will be heard, but this prayer is us speaking to Jesus Christ, who has been through death and come out the other side victorious. Thank you that you offer new life, just as you were raised to new life yourself. In the name and in the power of Jesus. Amen.